My name is Alara Finch, and for 24 years, I perfected the art of being invisible. It wasn't a talent I was born with, but one I learned out of necessity, a quiet armor for a quiet soul. This skill, this ability to blend into the background like forgotten furniture, is what made me the ideal candidate for the position of companion to the Dowager Duchess of Blackwood. I was meant to be a shadow in a grand house, a whisper of assistance for an elderly woman. And for 6 months, I was exactly that. But one cold, windswept afternoon, a single thoughtless impulse shattered my invisibility forever. A frantic lunge into the path of a bullet I never saw coming. An act that saved the life of a duke who barely knew my name, and in doing so, ended my own quiet existence. I became the most visible person in his world, a world of unimaginable danger and closely guarded secrets. Before I tell you how a nameless girl became the unwavering focus of a powerful duke and a living target for his hidden enemies, I'd love to know where you're watching from today. Let me know down in the comments. And if you've ever felt overlooked only to find your strength in the most unexpected moment, go ahead and hit that like button. For all of you joining for the first time, make sure you subscribe because this is a community for stories just like this one. The drive to Blackwood Manor had felt like a journey to another century. The iron gates, each topped with the snarling head of a wolf, the Blackwood crest, parted with a groan that seemed to echo through the ancient oaks lining the long, winding drive. The manor itself didn't rise from the landscape so much as command it. It was a Gothic masterpiece of gray stone, sharp angles, and countless mullioned windows that glittered like 1,000 unblinking eyes. It was imposing, magnificent, and utterly terrifying. From the moment I stepped out of the car, my simple tweed coat feeling woefully inadequate, I felt like a ghost haunting a place I had no right to be. The inside was even more daunting. A great hall with a ceiling so high it seemed to hold its own weather, walls lined with stern-faced portraits of ancestors who all looked down with undisguised disapproval. The air itself felt heavy with history and expectation. I was met not by the Duchess, but by the housekeeper, Mrs. Gable. She was a woman who seemed to be constructed from the same stern material as the manor itself, all sharp lines, starched fabric, and a gaze that could measure a person's worth, or lack thereof, in a single sweeping glance. She looked me up and down, her thin lips pressed into a line of neutrality that was somehow more intimidating than a frown. "Miss Finch," she said, her voice crisp and devoid of warmth. "Her Grace is resting. I will show you to your quarters. Your duties are simple. You are here for the Dowager Duchess. You will read to her, accompany her on her walks, and take your meals with her in her private sitting room. You are not to trouble the rest of the household." The unspoken part of her speech hung in the air. You are to remain invisible. My rooms were in a quiet, forgotten wing of the manor. They were comfortable, far more than I was used to, with a small fireplace and a window overlooking a walled garden. But they were isolated, reinforcing my status as an outsider, a temporary fixture in this permanent world of lineage and legacy. The staff were polite but distant. They addressed me as Miss, but their eyes slid past me as if I were made of glass. I was the Duchess's girl, a functional object, not a person with a history or a heart. And so I leaned into the role I knew best. I spoke only when spoken to, I kept my eyes down in the grand hallways, and I made my presence as small and unobtrusive as possible. I became the ghost Mrs. Gable wanted me to be. My sole connection, my entire world within those stone walls, became the Dowager Duchess Beatrice. She was nothing like her formidable surroundings. Where the manor was severe, she was possessed of a dry, sparkling wit. Frail in body, her hands gnarled with age, she had a mind as sharp and clear as a winter morning. In her eyes, which were a startlingly pale blue, I saw a kindness and a perception that missed nothing. She didn't treat me like an employee. She treated me like a confidant. In the beginning, it was formal. I would read aloud from her favorite poets, my voice a low murmur in the quiet of her sun-drenched sitting room. We would take slow, careful walks through the rose gardens, her arm linked through mine more for companionship than support. Slowly, the professional distance melted away. We discovered a shared love for mystery novels and a mutual disdain for marzipan. She would tell me stories of her youth, of a world of glamour and intrigue that seemed as fantastical as any fiction. And sometimes she would speak of her son, the Duke. "Alastair carries the weight of centuries on his shoulders, Alara," she told me one afternoon, her gaze distant as she watched a hawk circle high above the estate. "This title, this land, it is a heavier burden than anyone can imagine. It has forged him from something harder than stone." I had only caught glimpses of him, this man of stone. His Grace, Alastair Blackwood, the 12th Duke of his line, was a phantom of a different sort. He was a presence, a palpable weight in the house, even when he wasn't there. On the rare occasions our paths crossed in a hallway or on the grand staircase, he was a fleeting vision of impeccable tailoring, dark hair, and a face that looked as if it had been carved from granite. His eyes, a shade of gray as stormy as the skies over the moors, would pass over me without a flicker of recognition. A curt, clipped good evening was the most I had ever heard him direct at me. He was a force of nature, a storm of quiet intensity, and I was merely a leaf caught in the outermost eddies of his world, utterly beneath his notice. He was handsome, I suppose, in that severe, unapproachable way that gods and kings are depicted in old paintings. But his coldness was a wall I had no desire to scale. The peace of Blackwood Manor, however, was a fragile illusion. I soon began to notice the cracks in its serene facade. The Duke would often be closeted in his study for hours, his voice a low, angry rumble that could be faintly heard even through the thick oak door. I saw him once through the slightly ajar doorway, pacing like a caged panther, a phone pressed to his ear, his face a mask of controlled fury. "This ends now," I heard him snarl into the receiver. "Thorne has gone too far. I will see him ruined." The name meant nothing to me then, but the venom in his tone sent a shiver down my spine. The staff would whisper amongst themselves in hushed tones, their conversations ceasing the moment I drew near. Words like corporate rivals, threats, and betrayal drifted through the servants' hall like smoke. It was clear that beyond the manicured lawns and ancient walls, the Duke was fighting a war I couldn't comprehend. One blustery afternoon in late autumn, the Dowager Duchess was feeling unwell and had retired to her rooms after lunch. I found myself at a loose end, a rare occurrence. I was in the library, a magnificent 2-story room that smelled of old paper and beeswax, searching for a new book to read, when the Duke entered. The sudden shift in the room's atmosphere was immediate. It was as if the air itself had grown heavier, charged with his presence. I froze, my hand hovering over a leather-bound volume of poetry. I expected him to ignore me as usual, to stride to his desk and become absorbed in his work. Instead, he stopped. "Miss Finch," he said. His voice was deep and resonant, and the simple act of him saying my name was so unexpected it felt like a physical touch. I turned, my heart giving a nervous little flutter. "Your Grace," I murmured, my eyes fixed on a point somewhere over his shoulder. "My mother tells me you are an excellent walker," he stated, not asked. "She suggested I get some air. That I should not walk alone." It was the most awkward of invitations, clearly born of his mother's prodding rather than any personal desire for my company. It felt like a command wrapped in the thinnest veneer of courtesy. But to refuse a duke was unthinkable. "I would be happy to accompany you, Your Grace," I managed to say. The walk was a study in stiff formality. We left the warmth of the manor and set out across the sweeping parkland, a cold wind whipping strands of my hair across my face. The sky was a canvas of bruised purples and stormy grays. For the first 10 minutes, the only sounds were the crunch of our shoes on the gravel path and the sighing of the wind through the skeletal branches of the trees. He walked with a long, purposeful stride, his hands clasped behind his back, his jaw tight. I had to practically jog to keep up. I felt a ridiculous urge to fill the silence, to say something, anything, to ease the tension that stretched between us like a wire. "The autumn colors are lovely this year," I said, my voice sounding small and foolish against the vastness of the landscape. He glanced briefly at the fiery canopy of a distant maple tree. "They are," he agreed, his tone clipped. We walked on. He seemed a world away, his mind clearly on the battles he was fighting in London, the ones that made his voice a low snarl on the telephone. I was just a necessary accessory for his walk, a placeholder for a companion. And then he surprised me again. "My mother is fond of you," he said, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "She says you have a calming presence." "She is very kind to me," I replied softly. "She is a remarkable woman." "She is," he agreed, and for a fleeting moment the hard lines of his face softened. "She has endured a great deal." We lapsed back into silence, but it felt different now, less strained. He had, in his own way, acknowledged me. He knew I was more than just a name on his payroll. He knew I was important to his mother. We reached a small stone bridge that arched over a rushing stream, the water brown and frothy with recent rain. We had been walking for nearly an hour, and the cold was beginning to seep into my bones. He stopped in the middle of the bridge, leaning against the parapet and looking down into the churning water below. He finally seemed to be relaxing, the tension easing from his shoulders. The woods on the far side of the stream were dense and dark, a tapestry of deep greens and shadowy browns. The world seemed to hold its breath. It was in that moment of stillness that I saw it. A flicker of movement in the trees. A flash of reflected light, impossibly bright against the gloomy backdrop. A glint of sunlight off something metallic. My mind didn't have time to process what it was, to form a coherent thought. There was no logic, no decision. There was only a primal, overwhelming instinct. A sudden, cold certainty that the Duke, the unmovable man of stone standing beside me, was in terrible danger. The world seemed to slow down, the sound of the rushing water fading to a dull roar in my ears. I didn't shout. I didn't scream. I acted. In one fluid, desperate motion, I launched myself from the spot where I stood and slammed into him with all my might. The impact was jarring, like hitting a solid wall. He let out a grunt of surprise, his hard body absorbing the force of my lunge. We stumbled together, a tangle of limbs, his surprise turning to anger. "What in God's name?" he began to snarl. His words were cut short by a sharp, cracking sound that split the air, louder than a whip, followed by the sickening whine of something slicing through the space where his head had been a second before. A chunk of stone exploded from the bridge's parapet behind us, spraying us with stinging fragments. We fell to the ground in a heap, my body half draped over his. For a heartbeat, there was only a ringing silence. Then chaos erupted. Shouts echoed from the direction of the manor as estate guards, who had been following at a discreet distance, began to sprint toward us. Another crack echoed from the woods, but this one was wider of the mark, thudding into the soft earth nearby. Alistair rolled, moving with a speed and grace that was terrifying, covering my body with his own, his arm clamped around my head, pressing my face into the rough wool of his coat. I could feel the thundering beat of his heart against my cheek. He was shouting orders, his voice a raw, furious bellow that bore no resemblance to the cold, controlled man I knew. "Get down! Tri-line formation! Flush them out! Now!" The world was a blur of noise and confusion. I was trembling, the adrenaline a sickening, sour taste in my mouth. I tried to push myself up, to see what was happening, but his arm held me fast. "Stay down," he commanded, his voice a low growl in my ear. But then I felt it. A warm, wet sensation spreading across my shoulder, a strange, searing heat that blossomed into a fierce, throbbing pain. I gasped, a sharp, involuntary intake of breath. Alistair went rigid above me. He pulled back just enough to look at me, his stormy gray eyes wide with a dawning horror. His gaze dropped to my shoulder, where a dark crimson stain was rapidly spreading across the pale fabric of my blouse. "You're hit," he breathed, the words laced with disbelief and a fury so profound it seemed to shake him to his core. "You're hit. My God, Alara." He said my name again, but this time it wasn't a formal address. It was a prayer, a curse. He didn't wait for the guards to secure the area. In one powerful movement, he scooped me up into his arms as if I weighed nothing. My head swam, the pain in my shoulder a white-hot nova. "You saved my life," he said, his voice rough with emotion as he began to run, with a long, ground-eating stride, back toward the manor. "You foolish, brave, incredible girl." "Why?" I couldn't answer. I could only look up at his face, at the shattered remnants of his composure. The mask of the cold, untouchable Duke was gone, and in its place was a man, raw and terrified and fiercely, terrifyingly protective. The invisible girl was gone, too. In her place was a woman bleeding in the arms of a Duke, a woman who had just become a target. The return to the manor was a chaotic whirlwind. Alistair burst through the doors, shouting for Mrs. Gable, for a doctor, for his head of security. The staff, who had only ever seen him as the epitome of icy control, stared in stunned silence. I was the center of this storm, a bleeding, trembling bundle in his powerful arms. He didn't take me to my quiet rooms in the forgotten wing. He carried me up the grand staircase, past the disapproving portraits of his ancestors, and into the ducal wing, a part of the house I had never even seen. He laid me gently on a plush chaise lounge in a vast, opulent sitting room, his movements urgent but surprisingly tender. "Get the doctor here now, Caspian," he snarled at a tall, stern-looking man who had appeared at his side. "And lock this estate down. No one in, no one out. I want a full sweep of the grounds. Find him." "Yes, Your Grace," the man, Caspian, replied, his own face grim as he backed out of the room, already speaking into a device on his wrist. Alistair turned back to me, his focus absolute. He knelt beside me, his expensive trousers heedless of the priceless Aubusson carpet. He carefully began to tear the fabric of my sleeve to get a better look at the wound. It's just a graze, I whispered, though the pain was making spots dance in my vision. I'll be fine. Be quiet, he ordered, though his voice lacked its usual bite. It was strained, thick with an emotion I couldn't name. You took a bullet meant for me, Alara. You are far from fine. The doctor arrived, a portly man with kind eyes who seemed flustered by the Duke's frantic energy. Alistair stood over him like a hawk as he cleaned and dressed the wound, never once taking his eyes off me. The bullet had indeed just grazed my shoulder, tearing through flesh but missing bone and artery. It was painful but not life-threatening. The relief that washed over Alistair's face was so profound it was almost painful to watch. When the doctor had finished, bandaging my shoulder tightly, Alistair dismissed him with a curt nod. Then he turned to Mrs. Gable, who was hovering in the doorway, her face pale with shock. "Prepare the rose suite for Miss Finch," he commanded. "Have her things moved immediately." The rose suite, I knew from staff gossip, was the suite of rooms adjoining the Duke's own private chambers, reserved for the most honored of guests. Mrs. Gable's eyes widened almost imperceptibly. "Your Grace, her own rooms are perfectly adequate. She is not leaving this wing." Alistair cut her off, his voice like cracking ice. "She is not leaving my sight until I know who did this and I know that she is safe. Is that understood?" "Perfectly, Your Grace," the housekeeper stammered, curtsying before scurrying away. I tried to protest. "Your Grace, that's not necessary. I can't possibly." "You can, and you will," he said, his gaze locking with mine. "This happened because of me. You are a target now. Your life as you knew it here ended on that bridge. Until this is over, you are under my protection. That is not negotiable." And so began the strangest days of my life. I was moved into the Rose Suite, a breathtakingly beautiful set of rooms with silk wallpaper, a 4-poster bed, and a private balcony. But it felt like a gilded cage. Guards were posted discreetly in the hallway outside my door. My meals were brought to me on a silver tray, and more often than not, Alistair would take his own meals with me, sitting in a wingback chair across from me in my private sitting room. The silence between us was no longer awkward and formal. It was heavy with unspoken thoughts, with the shared trauma of the attack. The rest of the household treated me with a new, bewildering reverence. Staff who had once looked through me now curtsied and addressed me in hushed, respectful tones. Mrs. Gable herself oversaw my care, her stern demeanor softened with a grudging respect. I was no longer the Duchess's girl. I was the woman who had saved the Duke. My time with the Dowager Duchess was now supervised. She would visit me in my new suite, her face etched with worry, but with a new light of keen interest in her eyes. "He hasn't left your side, I hear," she commented one afternoon, her fingers busy with her embroidery. "I haven't seen Alistair focused on a person since his father passed. He has built such high walls around himself." She looked at me over the rim of her spectacles. "You seem to have breached them, my dear, without even trying." The walls were certainly crumbling. Alistair's presence was a constant. If he had to work, he did so at the desk in my sitting room, the scratch of his pen a steady, comforting rhythm in the quiet. He would read to me when the pain in my shoulder made it difficult for me to hold a book. We started to talk, truly talk, for the first time. He asked about my life before Blackwood, about my family, or lack thereof, about my dreams. I learned about the crushing weight of his responsibilities, the constant political maneuvering, the isolation of being at the top. I saw the weary man beneath the ducal title, the loneliness in his stormy gray eyes. One evening, I woke from a nightmare, the sound of the rifle shot echoing in my ears, my heart pounding against my ribs. I must have cried out because seconds later, my bedroom door opened and Alistair was there, silhouetted in the dim light from the hallway. He was dressed in a simple shirt and trousers, his hair disheveled. "A nightmare?" he asked softly. I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. He didn't leave. He walked over and sat on the edge of my bed, not touching me, but his presence was a solid, reassuring anchor in the darkness. "He won't get to you," he said, his voice a low, fierce promise. "I will not let anyone harm you again, Alara." He stayed until my breathing evened out, until the trembling stopped. Just before he left, his fingers brushed against my uninjured hand, a brief, warm touch that sent a jolt of electricity straight to my heart. The investigation was proceeding slowly. Caspian would deliver daily updates. The assassin had been a professional, leaving behind no evidence but a single high-velocity shell casing. They were sweeping financial records, looking into Alistair's known enemies. The name Julian Thorne came up again and again. "He's ruthless," Alistair explained to me one afternoon as we sat by the fire. Our families have been rivals for generations, but this is a new level of depravity. I recently blocked a merger that would have made him the most powerful industrialist in the country. He would see it as a declaration of war. Hearing the cold reality of his world, the casual discussion of enemies and assassins, was terrifying. But strangely, I didn't feel like an outsider anymore. I was inside the fortress with him, a part of the siege. My defiance, when it came, was a small, quiet thing. After nearly a week of being confined to the suite, I was going stir-crazy. "I need some air," I told him one morning. "Just a walk in the walled garden." "It's not safe," he said immediately, his face closing off. "The garden is surrounded by 20-foot walls and your guards are everywhere," I countered, my frustration making me bold. "I am not a porcelain doll, Your Grace. I will not break. I cannot stay locked in here forever." He looked at me, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. He wasn't used to being challenged. I expected him to refuse, to pull rank. Instead, after a long moment, he gave a slow nod. "Very well," he said. "But I'm coming with you." The walk was a small victory, a reclaiming of a piece of my freedom. He walked beside me, his vigilance a palpable thing, but he let me lead the way, let me stop to admire a late-blooming rose, let me feel the sun on my face. That small act of trust, of seeing me as more than just a victim to be protected, felt more intimate than any touch. Caspian, the ever-watchful head of security, was not pleased with the Duke's growing attachment. I overheard them talking in the hall one day, their voices low and tense. "Your Grace, with respect, your focus on Miss Finch is a liability," Caspian argued. "The emotional component, it makes you predictable. It gives your enemy a new target." "My focus on Miss Finch," Alistair's voice was dangerously quiet, "is the only thing that is not a liability, Caspian. It is the only thing that currently matters. You will remember that." The conversation chilled me, but it also sent a secret, illicit thrill through me. I mattered to him. The apex of this strange, intense new intimacy came 2 nights later. The doctor had instructed me on how to change the dressing on my shoulder, but the angle was awkward and my movements were clumsy. I was struggling in front of the bathroom mirror when a soft knock came at the connecting door to his chambers. "Alara, do you need assistance?" Alistair's voice came through the thick wood. Before I could protest, he entered. He saw my predicament instantly. "Allow me," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. He gently took the roll of bandages from my hand. I stood frozen in my silk dressing gown as he stood behind me, his reflection meeting mine in the mirror. His hands were incredibly gentle as he unwrapped the old dressing, his fingers brushing against my skin. The air grew thick, charged with a tension that had nothing to do with danger. I could feel the heat radiating from his body, could smell the faint, clean scent of his soap. When the wound was exposed, his breath hitched almost silently. A long, angry red line on my pale skin. A permanent reminder of the day I'd saved him. As he applied the new dressing, his knuckles grazed the side of my neck, and I shivered. Our eyes met in the mirror, and the world seemed to fall away. There was only the charged space between us, the silent question hanging in his stormy gray eyes. He finished his task, his hands lingering on my shoulders. He leaned in, his face so close I could see the flecks of silver in his gray eyes. I thought he was going to kiss me. I wanted him to kiss me. My breath caught in my throat. But at the last second, with a shudder of restraint, he pulled back, his jaw tight. "I will not let him harm you," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "I swear it on my life." He turned and left the room, leaving me trembling, my heart hammering against my ribs, a willing captive in his gilded cage. After 2 weeks, a fragile sense of normalcy began to settle over Blackwood Manor. The investigation into the shooting had hit a wall, and with no new threats emerging, Alistair concluded that the failed attempt had scared the assassin off. He was still vigilant, but the oppressive lockdown began to ease. He wanted me to feel safe again, to believe that the danger had passed. To that end, he arranged a small, private dinner for the 3 of us, himself, his mother, and me, in the estate's glass conservatory. It was a beautiful, secluded space, a jewel box of wrought iron and shimmering panes of glass, filled with exotic plants and the soft scent of night-blooming jasmine. It was meant to be a step back toward civilization, a gesture of hope. It turned out to be a perfectly baited trap. Julian Thorne was a more cunning monster than Alistair had anticipated. He hadn't been scared off. He had been waiting, observing. He understood that Alistair's greatest strength, his fierce control, had become his greatest weakness. He knew the Duke would become obsessed with protecting the girl who had saved him, and that in his desire to give her a sense of peace, he would eventually lower his guard within the supposed safety of his own home. The dinner started peacefully. Soft candlelight flickered on the table, casting dancing shadows on the lush greenery around us. The Dowager Duchess was in high spirits, regaling us with a witty story from her youth. Alastair was more relaxed than I had ever seen him, a genuine smile touching his lips as he listened to his mother, his eyes frequently finding mine across the table, warm and reassuring. For a moment it felt real. It felt like we were just three people sharing a meal, not a duke, a dowager, and a target. The attack, when it came, was brutally efficient and utterly silent. There was no warning shot this time. One moment, I was lifting a wine glass to my lips. The next, the entire wall of glass behind Alastair exploded inward in a shower of glittering shards. A collective gasp, a strangled cry from Beatrice, and then instinct took over. This time, the target wasn't Alastair. The cold, calculating focus of the attack was aimed directly at me. Alastair moved with the same terrifying speed I'd seen on the bridge. He let out a roar of pure fury and launched himself across the table, overturning it, sending porcelain and crystal crashing to the marble floor. The heavy oak table became a makeshift barricade as he shoved both me and his mother behind it, shielding us with his own body. "Caspian!" he bellowed, his voice echoing in the enclosed space. A second shot rang out, punching a hole through the back of a wrought iron chair, inches from my head. Estate guards were converging, their shouts echoing from outside, but the assassin was already inside the perimeter. He was in the gardens just beyond the shattered glass wall, methodical and relentless. This was not a distant sniper's nest, this was a close-quarters assault. And Alastair was not just a duke, he was a warrior. He pushed us further behind the overturned table. "Stay down. Do not move," he commanded, his eyes blazing with a cold, lethal fire. He pulled a heavy, ornate silver candlestick from the wreckage of the table setting, gripping it like a club. The assassin, a dark figure clad in black, stepped through the gaping hole in the conservatory wall, a pistol with a long suppressor held steady in his hands. He was calm, professional, his movements economical. He ignored Alastair, his gaze fixed on me. And in that moment, something inside me snapped. I was not a damsel. I would not cower behind a table while the man I was beginning to love fought for my life. As the assassin raised his weapon, I saw a large, terracotta pot holding a small citrus tree just to my left. Without thinking, I scrambled for it, my injured shoulder screaming in protest. With a surge of adrenaline, I heaved it with all my strength. It wasn't graceful, but it was effective. The heavy pot flew through the air and crashed into the assassin's side, throwing off his aim just as he fired. The shot went wide, ricocheting off the stone floor with a high-pitched scream. That split-second distraction was all Alastair needed. He exploded from behind the table, a blur of motion. He didn't hesitate, didn't pause. He closed the distance and brought the silver candlestick down in a vicious arc, striking the assassin's gun hand. There was a sickening crack of bone, and the pistol clattered to the floor. The fight that followed was brutal and primal. It was a whirlwind of savage blows and desperate grapples amidst the broken glass and spilled wine. The Dowager Duchess, to my astonishment, showed her own form of metal. "You pathetic little ruffian," she shrieked at the assassin, her voice trembling but full of aristocratic fury. "How dare you interrupt our dinner?" It was so unexpected, so absurd, that for a fraction of a second, the assassin glanced her way. It was another opening. Pinned down behind a large marble pillar we'd retreated to, the sounds of the struggle terrifyingly close, Alastair risked a glance back at me. His face was streaked with dirt, a cut bleeding freely above his eye, but his gaze was clear and intense. "I should never have involved you in this," he said, his voice ragged between breaths. "Alara, if we get out of this..." He couldn't finish, the words choked off by the need for action. But his eyes, fierce and desperate, said everything his voice could not. "We will get out of this," I said, my voice shaking but my resolve like steel. "Together." The word hung in the air between us, a promise, a vow. It wasn't just his fight anymore. It was ours. At that moment, Caspian and his team swarmed into the conservatory from multiple directions, their professionalism a stark contrast to the chaotic brawl. They subdued the injured assassin with practiced efficiency, securing him in moments. The sudden silence was deafening, broken only by our harsh breathing and the distant whisper of the wind through the shattered glass. The immediate threat was over. Alastair stood panting, his chest heaving, the bloody candlestick still clutched in his hand. He looked from the captured assassin to me, and the primal fury in his eyes melted away, replaced by an expression of such overwhelming relief that it buckled his knees. He crossed the ruined room in 2 long strides, his hand reaching out, not to check for injuries, but to cup my face, his thumb stroking my cheek as if to assure himself I was real. And then, with a low groan that came from the depths of his soul, he pulled me into his arms. He held me so tightly I could barely breathe, his face buried in my hair. The carefully constructed walls around the Duke's guarded heart didn't just crumble. They were obliterated in a single, desperate act of claiming. He lifted his head, his stormy eyes searching mine, and then he kissed me. It wasn't a gentle, tentative kiss. It was fierce, possessive, a desperate and raw outpouring of every fear and feeling he had kept locked away. It was the taste of relief, of terror, of a love forged in the heart of violence. In the middle of the wreckage, surrounded by the evidence of a war that had invaded their home, our new reality was sealed. I was his and he was mine. The hours that followed the attack were a blur of organized efficiency. The subdued assassin was taken to a secure location on the estate for interrogation. The conservatory was cordoned off. The Dowager Duchess, after being checked by the doctor and given a strong brandy, was escorted to her rooms, her composure remarkably intact, though she gave me a long, meaningful look before she left. Alistair refused to let me out of his grip. He led me from the scene of the fight, his arm firmly around my waist, guiding me back to the safety of his wing. We didn't speak. There were no words for what had just happened, for the kiss that had changed everything. We sat in his study, the embers of a fire casting a warm glow on the room, and he held my hand, his thumb stroking back and forth over my knuckles, a steady, grounding rhythm. Caspian entered around dawn, his face grim. "He's talking," he said without preamble. "His name is irrelevant. A professional. He confirms he was hired by Julian Thorne." Alistair's jaw tightened, his knuckles going white where he gripped my hand. "The motive? It wasn't just the merger, Your Grace," Caspian continued, his eyes flickering towards me for a moment. "It's personal. Generational. Thorne believes your family has been the source of his family's every misfortune for a century. Your recent victory was simply the final humiliation. He wanted to break you. By killing her?" Alistair's voice was a low, dangerous growl. "No, Your Grace. That was the secondary objective. The primary objective was to make you watch. To make you suffer. He knew you would protect her. He wanted to torture you with the knowledge that the one person who showed you any sort of selflessness was in constant danger because of you. He wanted to turn your heart into your own personal hell. The cold, calculated cruelty of it stole my breath. I wasn't just a target. I was a weapon being used against the man beside me." Alistair's grip on my hand became painfully tight. He stood up, his entire body radiating a cold, lethal calm. "Thank you, Caspian. Get some rest. I will handle Thorne." When the security man had gone, Alistair turned to me. The firelight carved shadows on his face, making him look tired and infinitely vulnerable. "He was right," Alistair said, his voice rough. "Caspian. He warned me that my feelings for you were a liability. I brought this down upon you." "No," I said, standing to face him. "You didn't. A hateful man did. And what you feel," I reached up, my hand tracing the cut above his eye, "is not a liability. It's the most real thing in this house." He closed his eyes, leaning into my touch. "I cannot imagine this house or my life without you in it, Alara," he whispered. "When this is over, I want you to stay. Not as a companion. Not as an employee. As—" He trailed off, unable to find the right word, afraid of pressuring me, of trapping me in the life that had almost killed me twice. As the other half of Together, I finished for him softly. A slow smile, the first genuine smile I'd seen since the attack, spread across his face. "Yes," he breathed. "Exactly that. The next day I had a visitor. The Dowager Duchess summoned me to her private sitting room. I went with some trepidation, unsure of what her reaction would be to the undeniable shift between her son and me. She was sitting by the window, her embroidery untouched in her lap. She gestured for me to sit opposite her. "I saw the kiss, you know," she said, her tone matter-of-fact. My face flushed. "Your Grace, Beatrice, my dear. I think we are far past such formalities." She smiled, a small, knowing smile. I have not seen that look in my son's eyes since he was a boy who believed the world was full of wonder. He has been living in a fortress of his own making for decades. You didn't just save his life on that bridge, Alara. I do believe you are saving his soul. Her acceptance, her blessing, was a balm to my frayed nerves. It felt like the final piece of a puzzle clicking into place. Alistair's revenge on Julian Thorne was not one of violence. It was colder, more precise, and far more devastating. He didn't use assassins. He used accountants, lawyers, and journalists. For 2 days, he was a storm of quiet focus in his study. He made phone calls, sent encrypted emails, and met with powerful, sober-faced men who came and went from the manor like shadows. He systematically dismantled Thorne's empire from the inside out. He exposed financial crimes to the authorities, leaked evidence of corporate espionage to the press, and called in decades-old favors that caused Thorne's allies to abandon him in droves. On the 3rd morning, he walked into my sitting room, a newspaper in his hand. He laid it on the table. The headline was stark: *Industrialist Julian Thorne arrested for fraud and conspiracy. Empire crumbles. *, he had been utterly, completely ruined. Alastair watched me read it, his face unreadable. Then he came over to me, taking the paper and tossing it into the fire. We watched it burn. "It's over," he said quietly, his arm coming around my shoulders, pulling me against his side. "He can never hurt you again." In the warmth of his embrace, watching the last vestiges of the threat turn to ash, I finally felt safe. A few months passed. The chill of autumn gave way to the crisp, quiet beauty of winter. Life at Blackwood Manor found its new rhythm, a gentle cadence of peace and healing. The extra security guards were still present, but they were a discreet presence now, a reminder of a danger that had passed rather than one that was imminent. The manor itself felt different, lighter. The oppressive weight of history and secrets had lifted, replaced by a quiet, joyful warmth that seemed to emanate from its very stones. My days were a gentle mix of the old and the new. I still spent my afternoons with Beatrice, but our conversations were no longer just about books and the past. They were about the future, about wedding plans and guest lists, our laughter echoing in the sunlit room. The staff, led by a Mrs. Gable who now treated me with a warmth that bordered on affection, no longer saw me as an appendage of the household. I was to be its future. I had a voice, an opinion that was sought and respected. I had found my place. My mornings were spent with Alastair. We would have breakfast together, a quiet, intimate ritual that was my favorite part of the day. The formidable, unapproachable Duke was gone, replaced by a man who would smile at me over his coffee cup, his stormy gray eyes soft with love. He would touch my hand across the table, a simple gesture that spoke volumes. The fear and violence that had forged our bond had receded, and in its place, a deep, abiding love had taken root and blossomed. One bright, cold afternoon, when the ground was dusted with a fine layer of frost that crunched under our boots, Alastair asked me to go for a walk. He led me along the same path we had taken on that fateful day, down across the parkland and toward the stream. My heart beat a little faster as we approached the small stone bridge, the memory of that day still vivid. But there was no fear, only a sense of coming full circle. He stopped me in the very center of the bridge, in the exact spot where he had been standing when I saw the glint of the rifle. He took both of my hands in his grip warm and steady. "This place," he began, his voice low and serious, "should be a monument to the worst day of my life. A place of tragedy and fear." He looked around at the bare trees, the rushing water, the healed scar in the stone parapet where the bullet had struck. "But it isn't. For me, this is where my life truly began. It's the place where a quiet, invisible woman showed me what true courage was. It's the place where I started to feel again." He looked down at me, his gaze so intense it felt like a physical touch. "You were the quiet in my world of noise, Alara. You were the stillness in my storm. Now, you are the heart of it all." Then, to my utter astonishment, he released my hands and slowly, deliberately, got down on one knee on the cold stone of the bridge. He didn't present a ring box, not yet. He just looked up at me, the powerful Duke of Blackwood, kneeling before the companion he had once never even seen. "I didn't just fall in love with you, Alara Finch," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I feel as though I was reborn in your light. Be my wife. Be my partner. Be my duchess." Tears streamed down my face, freezing on my cheeks in the cold winter air. I could only nod, unable to speak. "Yes," I finally whispered. "Yes. Always yes." He rose and slipped a ring onto my finger, a beautiful, simple sapphire the color of his mother's eyes, flanked by 2 brilliant diamonds. And he kissed me, a kiss of promises kept and a future begun. The nameless, invisible girl was well and truly gone. In her place stood a woman who was loved, a woman who was seen, a woman who had found her home not in the grandeur of a title or an estate, but in the safe, protected space of a duke's closely guarded heart. I am Alara Finch, and soon I will be Alara, Duchess of Blackwood. My journey from the shadows into the light wasn't one I ever could have imagined, but looking back, I wouldn't trade a single terrifying moment of it. It taught me that our greatest strengths often lie dormant, waiting for the right moment to show themselves. It taught me that true visibility isn't about being seen by the whole world, but about being truly, completely seen by the one person who matters most. And it taught me that sometimes the greatest love stories don't start with a glance across a crowded room, but with a selfless act on a cold, lonely bridge. Have you ever had a moment that changed the entire course of your life? I would be honored to hear your story in the comments below. Thank you for listening to mine. If my journey resonated with you, please don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more stories of unexpected strength and love. And if you know someone who might need to hear this, feel free to share it with them. Thank you for joining me today. I wish you all the strength and courage on your own journeys.